which is Luca Mezzalira. He will kick off the conference with a keynote, the perfect micro frontends platform. Luca is a principal solution architect at AWS, international speaker, and also a book author. In fact, his book, Building Micro Frontends, will be one of the raffle prizes at the end of his keynote session. Luca has over 20 years of experience in architecting front-end solutions and cloud solutions. And in his talk, he will cover some questions he often gets asked. So like, how do I implement micro frontends in my company? Or what are valuable recommendations for implementation micro frontends? Using real-world examples and best practices, Luca will give us some insights into what is the best and ideal mindset for implementing micro frontends. So Luca, welcome on the stage.
Hi, Lothar. Thank you very much for having me. It's a huge pleasure being here.
Yeah, we're very happy to have you here on site in our offices. And now I think we're looking forward to your session. And Luca, the stage is all yours.
Perfect. Fantastic. So let's share. Okay, so I think you can see the slides and we can kick off. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone that is listening around the world. So I'm thrilled to be here today. I want to start with the scenario that maybe is familiar with you, right? So you spent months to understand how you can untangle the dependencies across the teams. And at the end of the day, in this massive e-commerce platform, you decided to go through a journey into micro frontends. So you want to take your monolith, breaking down in multiple micro frontends. And then you did few POCs and you did the proof of concept with different technologies. But the one that really shined for you is Module Federation. So why that? Because Module Federation provides you a very frictionless experience, and you can start to remotely and dynamically retrieve JavaScript modules and therefore micro frontends for your application. You decided to go with React, and you started to, let's say, create your proof of concept, and everything is quite flawless. When you find yourself in a point that you need to deal with dependency management, Module Federation got you covered. And therefore, from here, you can start to have like all the different chunks that are produced by Module Federation that are loaded just once. Because suddenly, Module Federation takes care to load React just once, and all the other dependencies that are across the entire system that are loaded once. That's basically your microfrontends implementation. So you think that everything is sorted out, right? So everything is fine. You start to work, you start to spread the love of microfrontends across the teams. People start to work on that, start to build the first microfrontend, the second microfrontend, the third microfrontend. But is that all? Not quite. I've already been introduced, so I won't spend time on me, but the important things to know, that is the one thing that I want to highlight, is that the last 8 years, I had the pleasure to onboard into the microfrontends journey hundreds of teams worldwide, from New Zealand to Silicon Valley. And therefore, in this talk, I want to share with you what I have learned in all these engagements that, surprisingly also for me, was quite similar across the world. So let's start with the case study, edX. Okay, edX is an e-learning platform, and they, back in the days, a few years ago, like 5-6 years ago, they started to think about microfrontends. I spoke with one of their architects when I was speaker in New York, and we were discussing about microfrontends, and they created a framework called Open edX framework. And this framework basically enables them to have multiple teams that might be inside edX or might be from the community to build their microfrontends inside the edX platform. So the reason why they decided to go with microfrontends is for untangling the big ball of mud, as you can see from the screenshot that I took. The talk go through all the different, let's say, journey that they have done. So they started with, in 2019, to roll out the microfrontends approach. They created some strong libraries. So they have the login library that was shared, the authorization library was shared, the internalization library that was shared, and so on and so forth. They're defining a clear, let's say, interface for communicating with the rest of the system. And off you go. So you have like everything that you need, you might think. But the reality is that when they started to implement microfrontends, they were moving away from the old problems and they were onboarding new problems. For instance, the first problem was UX inconsistencies. And the reason being is that because the design system, despite was there, it wasn't enforcing anyhow. And of course, there wasn't the governance that enabled them to really reach the state that they wanted. Then they have a regression on customizability, and the reason being is because they move from a Django that allow every single team to or external parties to customize the way how the content was landing into the HTML to a more React-based approach, and therefore in that case they have like a more let's say templating approach where they provide some templates and everyone was use them, but not as much as they expected. Also because again, there were third parties that weren't coordinated by the core team, and therefore there was some challenges over there. Developing became harder for the first iteration because now you have like multiple people that are working in parallel without any control, and they are doing, let's say, whatever they need to do, trying to fix, let's say, their problem. But the thing is, if you don't have an overarching understanding of the platform, then it can become another big ball of mud, and in this case, a distributed ball of mud. And last but not least, in a few years, they ended up to have an incomplete replatforming, and therefore not all the ideal goals that they have set at the beginning were met, and therefore they need to stop and start to understand what could be done better. Because the complete freedom that they provided, despite a bunch of good solutions, led to slowing down the development. That was exactly the opposite of what they were looking for. And therefore, in 2023, they started again. They started to reason about what was working, what wasn't working. They started to be more opinionated. They started to provide, let's say, more guidelines on how to implement microfrontends. And if you're interested about that, you can see here their reasoning behind that. They went through a nice, let's say, a check of the different platforms available, and then they ended up to decide to go with Pyro. And I think is a testimony on how really you should think about microfrontends, because it's not a silver bullet. It's a way that will enable you and your team to succeed, but you need to make some effort in order to make it happen. So why didn't it work? That's the question that everyone is asking me. So, and this is not only for edX, there are many other case studies out there that they are claiming, oh yeah, we started with microfrontends, but they don't work. And they blame the architecture, but not quite, because architecture is just a part of a distributed system. So usually, when I talk about distributed system, backend or frontend, there are what I call the pillars of distributed system. But there are three: organization, culture, and system architecture. Those three elements, unfortunately for us, are tightly coupled. Every time that we touch one, the other two will be affected, for better or worse. And that what it means is that, for instance, if I receive very often the question, should we use monorepo or polyrepo in our microfrontends implementation? And there are certain people very opinionated that think, so monorepo will solve everything, or polyrepo will solve everything. The reality is just, you are not taking just a technical decision. What you are doing is defining the communication between teams. And if you start to think about that, you stop for a second and start to say, okay, I'm going to set. So if I'm having a polyrepo, I'm setting my team to communicate in a certain way. If I do monorepo in another way. And that's very important, because as you can see, when you take a design decision, you're going to affect some of those. The engineering practices definitely plays a crucial role in distributed system, and therefore it's very important that you have the culture to, let's say, enable the teams in order to foster the right engineering practices. Otherwise, it's difficult to blame an architecture, because an architecture is thus surfacing and expressing certain friction or not inside your organization. Okay, so very often I refer to this definition that I coined back in the days in 2017. So this one was, at the beginning when I started, was more rough. Now, I think in 2017, I just nailed it. And This is usually a definition that covers the key aspects of micro frontends. But let's start to focus on a chunk of that. Usually, I just go through this definition when I do my other presentation, but this would be pivotal to understand how important it is having clarity of what we need to express inside our architecture in order to succeed in our goals. So the first two parts is that micro frontends are a technical representation of business domain, and they allow independent implementation. Those two aspects are foundational for micro frontends. But let's try to drill down into that. When we talk about a representation of a business subdomain, there is a clear distinction between components and micro frontend. So a component, usually when you think about that, let's take the most, let's say, used component in the world, the button. When you build a button, you start to say, okay, so I want to create a label. So you expose property for a label and someone else will fill this label. Then suddenly you say, okay, I want to extend this button and add also the capability to add an icon if needed. And then you add the capability to change the border color, to have different rollover animation based on the portal that you're using. You start to have internationalization, and therefore you start to have auto size dimension, because we know that in certain language, let's say the same word can be expressed with more characters. And then finally, you have also the possibility to disable the button by default, because you are using a form, so you want that all the fields, mandatory fields, are filled before you enable the button. So all these things that we are defining here are abstraction on top of the capabilities of button. It doesn't make any sense that we are going to rewrite that every single time. So they make sense inside the component. But the problem with that is that we are optimizing for reusability. And reusability is a form of coupling. And it's not just me saying that. There are, let's say, well-known architects like Neil Ford that discuss about that extensively when talks about microservices. And therefore, we need to bear in mind that we are expressing, in this case, a technical concept, not a domain concept like Micro Frontends does. And what the Micro Frontend does instead is trying to encapsulate its own state, trying to encapsulate its own logic. Before, the button was leaking its domain to the container. The container understands how to use the button, and based on the context is enabling the button or changing certain properties for functioning inside the context as expected. But Micro Frontend cannot work in that way, otherwise it's not independent anymore. Therefore, the Micro Frontend is context aware. Understand what you need to express inside your system. It defines clear inputs and outputs, because in reality, what you want to have is this capability for others potentially to integrate with or to communicate with your micro frontend. And this is definitely less extensible. We are not optimizing for reusability, because the problem you have, as we said, that we are creating coupling, and we are moving on the complete opposite direction, trying to optimize for fast feedback and fast flow. Therefore, I want to give you some heuristics that you can take away to test if you are building micro frontends or not. So the first one, you need to have a very small API that is exposed usually to the container. Vast majority of the time, when you have the ID of your micro frontend, or sorry, ID of the product for a specific, let's say, things to render, and where to find the token, that usually by convention you can find from a cookie in memory or local storage, is more than enough for a micro frontend to function. You don't need to, let's say, expose a bazillion of other properties, because otherwise you are creating coupling. You are basically enabling the container to do more with the micro frontend. Therefore, every time you change the micro frontend, you need to change also the container. That is not where you want to go. The micro frontends are context aware. Therefore, what I just described fits very well in the description. You don't optimize for usability at all costs. It's obvious that is always a trade-off. You need to figure out if maybe a micro frontend can be useful in multiple contexts, and that's fine. That works, but you don't have to heavily optimize like you would do with the component. That's the key aspect that differentiates components from micro frontends. And last but not least, usually micro frontends are more coarse-grained. What I mean by that is that usually you don't have like 20 micro frontends in a view, because otherwise you have a distributed monolith that basically is nothing more than a bunch of components that are loaded at runtime, and you set up yourself for failure. So bear in mind, the last thing, that the micro frontends boundary, so how you identify micro frontends, is not forever. It's there for a reason. So at the beginning, you assess in a certain point in time that this is your micro frontends, or those are your micro frontends. But as a business evolves, as the maturity of the company evolves, as the complexity of a specific domain evolves, you need to revisit that. And therefore, what was working 6 months ago is not going to work in 6 months' time, because maybe the business drifts towards another direction. Or maybe now the complexity of the domain became so huge that the cognitive load of a team is not there anymore. And therefore, it's important that you take that with, let's say, a good pinch of salt when you are reassessing your microfrontends. And usually a suggestion that I provide to many customers that I speak with and many teams is try to have like a healthy feedback loop that every 6 months you are going to reassess if the microfrontends are still working, the boundaries of microfrontends are still working as expected. Okay, so now let's move into the other aspect, the organizational benefits provided by microfrontends, because many think, oh yeah, it's just a technical decision. This is not. Distributed systems weren't created for only technical reasons. They were created mainly for organizational one. Because I'm pretty sure that if you go to buy, I don't know, something in an e-commerce, you're not asking yourself if it's a microservice, it's a monolith, or whatever. You're probably interested to buy a product. And therefore, for that, obviously, there are some benefits on technical side. We will explore that. But the reason why we are using microfrontends in this case is for scaling your organization as well. So microfrontends benefits are obviously allows you to have incremental upgrades. That's great. You have a decentralization. Therefore, you start to have developers and teams that are part of the decision making. They are domain experts inside their system, and therefore they take decision and design decision that will enable them inside their domain to strive and to thrive and have all the things that they need. You try to reduce the cognitive load. That is fantastic, because it means that another person that is joining that team, he will be able to hit the ground running and start to see immediately some benefit of using microfrontends. An example usually I gave in my previous company, I had like engineers that joined a team that in no longer than 3 weeks, they were capable to ship code in production, because they just need to understand a portion of the system, and then later on they will understand more about how the things are working behind the scene and all the other domains and so on. But these definitely enable a lot of things. And last but not least, you want to scale your technology as well, the organization. If you know upfront that your team is going to grow due to the great success of your platform, microfrontends are definitely a good solution to look at. Now, the important things to understand, that is one of the pillars that I was describing before, is that any organization will produce a design that is a copy of the organization communication structure. This is not a new thing. As you can see, the Conway's law, as it's called, it was defined in 1967. It started to have relevance in the 80s, 90s, give or take, when people take more seriously this thing. But it makes a breakthrough with microservices in the early 2000s. And what I mean by that is that usually you cannot blame an architecture if your organization is not set up for enabling the architecture to flower, or the other way around. Both models will work by an architecture designed in a vacuum without taking into consideration the organization structure, how the teams are communicating, how they are working, what are the practices. It doesn't help you to achieve what you want. Just implementing microfrontends or implementing microservices inside an organization that is not set up with a decentralization mindset, is not set up for enabling the team to take their own decision, to have skin in the game, is not going to work. It's not going to provide you the benefit that you're looking for. And therefore, be careful when you are designing this kind of architecture, because just embracing a technical implementation in a context that doesn't allow you to strive, it might be a problem. And trust me, the problem is not the architecture, it's because of Conway's law. Now, when I talk about mindset, usually what we were used to work is something like that. And there are still many companies working this way. So we have like tech leadership that's composed by the platform team, the security team, the architecture team, and then there are engineering teams that are communicating together, they are tangled together, they have external dependencies, and there is this back and forth between these two layers inside the organization. Now, what we want to reach instead is something completely different. In 2019, there was the revolution around how to think about teams with the concept of team topology. The idea that the company should design their organization in order to have a distributed system that it enables them to achieve what they want, and their key characteristic of the distributed system was a must. And many companies moved from a decentralized mindset to a decentralized mindset using team topology. Team Topology is a fantastic book. If you didn't read it, I highly recommend. And start with the idea that we have stream-aligned teams. These teams are cross-functional teams that are responsible to deliver a specific area of your application. Obviously, every single company might design and assign, let's say, this domain differently. Obviously, if a company has thousands of developers that are working on the same system, their granularity will be, let's say, more fine-grained, and instead a company that is working with 5 teams might have like a completely different granularity, but it's fine. The idea is that we align our team to a stream-aligned work. Then we have obviously some complicated subsystem. It could be like a very difficult component, or you want to integrate with the data science team for sending a click stream of events that are happening from your front end in order to understand how the customers are using your platform. Then you have a platform team that is enabling your streamlined teams with tools, and in particular with a nice developer experience, with everything that is needed for security. So the streamlined team can think only and mainly to the creating value for the company and for the users. Because the reality is it doesn't make any sense that we reinvent the wheel every time, and we have like every single team that maybe ship a server-side rendering a Micro Frontends application with different type of containers or different container orchestration platform. So it's very important that we have a platform team that is enabling the others to succeed. Okay, but let's try to drill down into the platform responsibilities. So when we talk about the platform team, let's start to look into what they should do. A platform team usually defines the foundation for a distributed system. It's important to understand that sometimes you think about platform teams, sometimes they are core teams. It doesn't matter how you call it, but usually there is a bunch of people inside the organization that are cross-functional, sometimes people from security, sometimes architects, sometimes lead engineers or staff engineers. So one thing that usually they define at the beginning is how the system would work, how you are going to design. They run the POCs, they try to squeeze in all the functional requirement and non-functional requirement, all the business requirements, everything that is decided by the business. They start to identify how they want to use Micro Frontends. They start to decide how to compose, to route, and to communicate. This is something that they call, back in the days, the decision framework, that nowadays is still at the forefront of every single team that I spoke with worldwide, and they always refer to that when they are thinking how to structure their application. So when we start to drill down, we have different ways that we can identify Micro Frontends. We can have multiple of them in the same view. We can have one page or a group of pages per Micro Frontend. Usually I've seen customers mainly and teams starting with the vertical split, as I call it. So having one page or multiple pages that are representing a Micro Frontend. And when they're more mature, or if there is a requirement for a specific area of the application that require a horizontal split, so multiple Micro Frontends in the same view, because maybe there are multiple domains that has to be expressed in the same view, they go with the other approach. When we think about composition, we start to think about where I want to compose my Micro Frontends. In client-side rendering approach usually is happening at the client side. So you have like an application shell that is basically when you type mysite.com, that's the first thing that is going to download. An application shell will load the specific Micro Frontends for you, and that is composing the page, despite its vertical or horizontal split. On the server side, instead, you usually have a cluster of containers. You have like, I don't know, a serverless layer that is composing your Micro Frontends on the server. And in this case, maybe you are optimizing for organic SEO or for fantastic core web vitals metrics that you want to have. And therefore, doing server-side rendering is the thing that you're looking for. So either way, as you can see, there depends if you're doing client-side rendering or server-side rendering, you have an option in front of that. When we talk about routing, usually you have on the client side the application shell that takes care about that. It has the logic to say when the user goes from /catalog to /my account, knows where to fetch the Micro Frontend. And the other way around, because we are composing on the server every time there is a request is going to the server understands what is the request about and then fetch the right Micro Frontend for that. Either way that you're working, so if you're working with horizontal split or vertical split, you have also to think about communication, because the micro frontends are not living in a vacuum. And therefore, what it means is that when you have multiple micro frontends in the same UI, you can use a loosely coupled way for dealing with the communication. Event emitter is a good way. It's probably my favorite one. Custom events is another good one, and reactive streams usually are the most common one. I think I put them in the order that I've seen more often embraced by teams worldwide. So event emitter is probably nowadays one of the most used one, followed by very closely by custom events, and reactive streams is mainly used in certain situations. When you have, let's say, either horizontal or vertical split, you need to think also how you share by convention certain things. Think about the authorization token. So if you have a job token and you want to share, you can use local storage, you can use cookies, you can use in memory. And also when you want, for instance, to move from pass some ephemeral data from one page to another one, you can use query strings. And there you can append the ID of a product or something like that. And by convention, you say, okay, so to the micro frontend, you will fetch the ID from the query strings. Why I'm saying that these are, let's say, by convention, because the main difference is in one side, you define some code. On the other side, you might create an abstraction layer that is a library, but I would say that this is easily accessible from any front-end developer, and therefore you don't need to build any library around that unless you have, like, let's say, specific use cases. Okay, so when you define that, the platform team has to think about the application shell. There are some considerations that you need to take into account. The first thing is that has to be as vanilla as possible. I have seen often teams that start to, so if they have like some application that running, I don't know, in Angular or React, they write even the application shell in that way. My preference would be stay as, let's say, vanilla as possible, because they have more control on the update. Usually, the application shell is a good application shell if you, when you build that and everything is working and routing correctly, you don't have to change very often. And when you reach that stability, then having to dealing with multiple frameworks just for the sake of having a router doesn't make much sense to me. And therefore, usually what I recommend is going as vanilla as possible. It has to be context unaware. It's very important, this aspect. I have seen sometimes teams that start with the micro frontends implementation, and what happens is that now, because they want to share globally across multiple micro frontends certain information, they leverage the application shell because it's always there. But the problem is now every time that you change let's say a specific API, or you change the object or whatever, you need to change possibly also on the application shell. And this, let's say, coupling is not needed. You can use other techniques like leveraging in memory, or leveraging an API. Or you can leverage local storage, web storage. There are a bazillion ways that you can do that in order to avoid coupling between the application shell and the rest of the system. Because the moment that the application shell is done and dusted and tested, it should be, let's say, as stable as possible. Then, obviously, the application shell is the first thing that we load, especially if you do client-side rendering. It tends to expose certain configuration. In server-side rendering, I've seen as well that thing often, but because, let's say, every time that there is a change of a page, you need to call the server for doing the server-side rendering part, is less, let's say, relevant like in client-side rendering. And last but not least, bear in mind that the main reason why you build application shell is for being responsible for routing and composing. Everything else that you have in mind, maybe think twice before you arrive there. Okay, the other thing that the platform team should think about, because when they build the application shell, they know how to route and compose micro frontends, great. Now they have time because it's a stable application shell. They don't have to change every single time. So they can think about something more important that could be the developer experience. I'm a huge fan of developer experience for one main reason. Because in order to achieve the fast flow that, let's say, companies are looking for, and therefore to have a healthy feedback loop for developers, we need to have tools that enable us to reach this specific mindset. So the first thing that usually you define in developer experience is the guardrails, what you need to express inside your system. What I mean by that. So first of all, there are certain things that you really want to have available inside your system. For instance, performance. One thing that I was doing in my previous company before joining AWS was creating some, let's say, fitness function that usually are some function that you can run for expressing certain architecture characteristics inside your system. And what I was doing is every time that one developer, one team was opening a PR in Git, we were running a Git hook that was basically calling an API. We were cloning the specific repository. We were building on the fly the system, and we were checking that the output of that micro frontend was inside a certain threshold for the budget size of our micro frontend. That means that we didn't have any, let's say, surprises when it goes to production. So the team couldn't ship megabyte of a micro frontend. They have to be, let's say, wise in the way how they were handling the different dependencies, and that enabled us to take care about the performance. Obviously, you can think more about that. You can think to integrate any visual tool that you want to have for regression testing. You can let's say check core web vitals dynamically when you before sending to before publishing to production. So there are a bazillion of ways that you can think about that. But this is a guardrail that should be thought on how you want to let's say express a certain behavior of the teams closer to the team actions. So if you can shift towards where the developers are working, therefore a GitHub repository is definitely a good choice. Updating shared library was another cool thing. So how can we update a library that we have shared? Usually design system or login libraries are the classic thing that you share in micro frontends. How can you create a mechanism that will enable you to do that? Maintaining the required security posture. For instance, you want to make sure that no one is adding API keys inside the front end or in GitHub. And therefore, you can scan your repositories in order to make sure that nothing is leaking outside your application. And potentially you can have other architecture characteristics, but those are the guardrails that I'm mentioning when I'm thinking, okay, so we need to find a way to solve the most common problems to have an healthy environment for the developers. And that is baked into the developer experience, because if we can create these automatically, then developers will thrive without any problem. The other thing is that I've seen very often is the usage of let's say portals that usually are API portals for creating also templates, and often also for micro frontends. I've seen customers worldwide that embrace Backstage, that is an open source platform, was created by Spotify, and that now is used worldwide by multiple companies that use that for leveraging micro frontends templates. So they create like a template of a micro frontend, so I don't have to spin up a custom project, start to let's say import the libraries or whatever. The core team is responsible for creating and maintaining these templates that the new team that wants to spin up a micro frontend just clone the project from there, and then off you go. They have already baked in maybe the CI/CD or the different information needed for starting, and they can focus on creating the value for the company and for the user. Last but not least, deployment. So deployment is another key characteristic, because when you think about that, very often mature teams, when they reach the moment that, okay, we go to production with the first micro frontend, second micro frontend, and so on, they start to think, how can we make the deployment easier and smoother? Because if you use exactly the same way how you were doing, monolithic architecture is not that simple. Usually, the suggestion is the characteristics I want to see in deployments for distributed system is that it has to be incremental, frequent, so fast feedback loop that we said before, and it has to be independent. The moment that I found myself, they have to coordinate with multiple micro frontends, I need to go back to the whiteboard and understand if some domain leaked around. And therefore, in order to reach that, I created a working group back in 2022 that started to look into this problem. The thing is, as you can see, there are a few familiar faces: the creator of Single SPA, Joel Denning, the creator of Open Components, Matteo Figus, and the creator of Mod Federation, that is Zach Jackson. And I worked for a year with these guys and trying to figure out how we can help the community for doing that. And we come up with this JSON schema, not too opinionated, that enables you to define where to find the micro frontends. So when I load my application shell, I call an API that tells me what micro frontends are available inside my system, and I can start to load these micro frontends straight from this point. But because we are calling a micro frontend through, I call an API for retrieving my micro frontends, I thought also that would be very nice to use that mechanism for leveraging the possibility to apply canary release and blue-green deployment like we are doing microservices for decades. And it's very important, this aspect, because it will enable you to easily deploy your solution without too much burden. So in this slide, for instance, you can see that the same micro frontend, there are multiple versions, and this version can have redirect traffic towards one version or another one incrementally. That is a fantastic mechanism that I've seen teams striving with that, especially because when they start to have a safe net, as I call it, they start to feel more confident to say, okay, I want to deploy this 5% of the traffic and see if this code will impact the performance of my application. And if it doesn't, it will impact only 5% of your user base. You can even go more granular and say only in this specific country or only for this specific browser. It's up to you to define this thing. So if you are interested in this project, it's completely open source. It's called Frontend Discovery. And if you want to contribute, you want to know more, you can find that in this link here. Now, I didn't stop there. When I started to look into how to implement this thing, I thought, okay, so in order to, let's say, do something like that, I have my application shell calling the service. The service is, let's say, querying a database, and then is returning all the logic to the front end. But hang on a sec. So this part here is exactly the same for every single application, not only micro frontends, even for single-page applications or server-side rendering. So that could be a very nice project to extract and remove what we call in AWS the undifferentiating heavy lifting for our users. And therefore, with a bunch of other guys, we built internally this open source project. It's called Frontend Service Discovery. This is available again. You can clone it. You can change the code. I have already quite a few large organizations worldwide using that in production. And that is a fantastic testimony on how the community can really help to solve common problems, because usually, in my experience, teams don't have the time or don't have the skills for doing that. In this case, you click a button, you deploy in your AWS account, and you have what you really need for dealing with canary release, blue-green deployment, and discoverability micro frontends in a very vanilla fashion, because it can be pluggable to any CI/CD. You don't have to change the way how you are deploying your micro frontends. You just add one step for telling this system how it should roll out a micro frontend. Inside this README file, you can find also a talk that I did in order to show a live demo and everything. Okay, so now we have discussed quite a lot about the platform team. Let's look into the value stream teams. So value stream teams have few responsibility. Obviously, we have seen the rest, but we are want to look into deciding the technology, because that's up to them. We said we decentralize this decision, but it's important to take care about a couple of things. Back in the days when Micro Frontend Word came out in 2016 from the ThoughtWorks Tech Radar, it started to move very fast, this movement, especially for certain organizations, that we end up in what is called the Micro Frontends anarchy. That was a term coined by me. It was in 2020, if I remember well, the Tech Radar of ThoughtWorks started to call it in that way, because what happened is, without guardrails, people start to choose a specific framework, implement that, and then suddenly a mess, because performance-wise, we know that is not going to work. And by the way, if you're building currently single-page application or server-side rendering one, despite you can have multiple frameworks in the same page, you would not do that. So why you leverage that with Micro Frontends? There are certain situations where I see the value of that when you are, for instance, migrating from one existing monolithic architecture to Micro Frontends. So for a certain period of time, you will deal with multiple frameworks, and that's okay. But let's say don't optimize for that. The other thing is minimize the code share. Okay, this is the most controversial part. I remember when I started to talk about that, I was grilled in conferences by my engineers. It was like very complicated time for me. But if you look into why I was doing that, is because duplication is far cheaper than the wrong abstraction. And therefore, we need to be mindful in the way how we are dealing with components and Micro Frontend, and these defining clear boundaries on how to identify that. So you want to definitely reduce the external dependencies, and therefore having bazillion of share libraries is not going to help with that. It's against basically the architecture we are building. We want to optimize for the fast flow, and therefore, if I don't have external dependency, everything is inside the control of my team, and therefore I'm going to reach this fast flow. And last but not least, we want to have a lean mindset. Why starting to pre-optimize, thinking, oh yes, this library will be used across the entire company, and then suddenly 6 months later is used by only 2 teams, and you are creating all this complexity that is not needed. Maybe it's better that you start to duplicate. At some point, you organize a meeting between 2 teams, say, oh, by the way, we're using the same thing. How can we do an abstraction in order to capitalize on the investment? That is by far a more interesting discussion than starting to think and plan for, let's say, winning the world with your shell library. One heuristic that I want to provide you is trying to look into these libraries. Those are the classic things that I've seen very often shared by teams. So you can have login library, analytics library, design system library, and data layer library. But the rate of change of code is a good indicator, though. Usually a data layer might, let's say, have a high rate of change, because that data layer, if it's shared across all the system and you have a microservices approach, you are designing the organization in order to, let's say, thrive and define their own independent API. So if they change it, they need to quickly change in their system. But if you have a data layer library, now suddenly everyone has to wait that the data layer is changed, and then they can start to consume that API. Now is a problem. And therefore, rate of change is a fantastic heuristic to tell you if that specific library should be shared or not. That is great to understand. It's also a good way when you are thinking about micro frontends for identifying boundaries. This is usually rate of change is something that we don't look very often, but I really encourage you to use as a heuristic to have like a direction of travel for your decisions. Last but not least, the ownership part. For me, in 2024, a team responsible for micro frontends should code the micro frontends, obviously, test the micro frontends, quite important, deploy and monitoring. That is usually, I still not see, let's say, everywhere. Vast majority of the company I speak with, they are doing that, but it's very important they have visibility of what is going to be in production and knows having their own dashboard and understand how to debug their micro frontend, and adhere to guardrails. Those 4 things are the key let's say, aspects for maintaining the ownership of micro frontend. That doesn't mean you are the only team that can contribute on the code base of that micro frontend, but you are responsible for what is emerged inside the code base. The moment it goes in production, you will be responsible to handle that part. So one thing that I highly recommend is having a shift left mindset. So the more you can do...
Luca, we need to look a little bit at the time, because we're already at 45 minutes.
I'm almost finished.
Oh, thank you very much.
You're welcome. We are moving to left as much as possible. Obviously, that's not all. And there are, let's say, more things that we need to take into account. And I don't I underestimate the coding challenges. Absolutely. I know the server-side rendering is still cryptic, and we need to do a better job. Observability is not democratized yet for front-end development. End-to-end testing, we could do a better job as a community. Security, events management, and performance are another thing that we need to think about. But the thing that I describe in this talk are our key elements when we are designing micro frontends. The rest you can derive. There are, let's say, great tutorial books around how to apply server-side rendering, how to do observability, etc. But the things that I describe in this talk are usually the hidden things that we don't think straight away, because they are not surfacing immediately when we are designing a platform. Okay, so what we have seen so far. So we have seen the micro frontends are what micro frontends are and how to distinguish between micro frontends and component. We have seen the team ownership in micro frontends, that is important. We have understood the importance of feedback loop and fast feedback loop especially, and how this centralized mindset can help us to build the right platform. But I want to share one more thing with you. So in the last few months, I started, let's say, to work on share even more content on micro frontends. And I created this newsletter that is a fortnightly newsletter that is available for free if you go to this link, and you will be able to subscribe without any problem. And as I mentioned, if you follow me on social, I mentioned yesterday that I have an announcement to make. And today I want to share with you that the second edition of my book, Building Micro Frontends, is reality. There are already 2 chapters in the Riley platform. Other 3 are coming in the next few weeks. And I'm rewriting that. Half of the book will be completely rewritten. I will add more information, and a lot of the things that I described today will be covered in depth. That's all I got. I hope that you enjoyed the session. If you have any question, feel free to reach me out in the Discord server or in social network. Thank you very much for having me, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much, Luca, for all the considerations and insights, and also your announcements for the second edition of your book. I'm looking forward to read it. Now, we have a few questions, which we, I think, still can squeeze in before we go into the raffle. So the first question is from Florian, which is, are teams focusing too often on the technical parts / development rather than on the overall flows or the system?
I think it's natural that the developers are looking into that because it's the part that they are going to deal day to day. However, I think they should surface the need of looking more holistically across the application. You cannot design a distributed system without taking into account also the practice that I described in my talk.
Okay, thank you. And then another question. What about a design system library? What would you suggest in this case?
Design systems are common to share. Usually what I recommend is using web components because when you build with that, you are framework agnostic, and therefore it's easier to deal with change of framework without any problem. Now, the thing that I usually recommend is having design system and using for updating them across Micro Frontends, something like Dependabot. Is a tool available in all the version control system that basically you can enforce the update of a library. It can be automatic, or it could be like a digest that is coming to the email of the teams. Either way, depends on how you want to handle, but either way is a fantastic tool for enforcing this kind of shared libraries across a distributed system. We are doing in AWS very often for microservices and for our system. So it's a tool that is widely used in the industry also for Micro Frontends.
Okay, and thank you very much.